Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Sam Raskoff. I'm a professor at the law school here at NYU. And on behalf of the law school and the NYU Center for Cybersecurity, I am delighted to welcome you to tonight's program. We are thrilled to have with us the country's inaugural National Cyber Director, Chris Inglis. To say that Chris is the first occupant of this office, having been nominated by President Biden and confirmed last July by the Senate, is to be reminded of the extraordinary and frankly sobering moment that we are all currently living through. I expect that Chris will have a lot to say about that moment shortly. But Director Inglis, being the selfless public servant that he is, probably won't have a lot to say about himself.
And neither should you.
But I would be remiss if I had nothing to say. And in fact, there are a couple of things that I think are important to say. Briefly, Chris is a graduate of the United States Air Force Academy. He went on subsequently to earn multiple graduate degrees in technical fields. He's been a public servant for 4 decades, 3 decades of which roughly were spent at the NSA, the National Security Agency, where Chris rose to serve as deputy director of that organization from 2006 to 2008 to 2014. In addition to being a public servant, Director Inglis is an accomplished academic. He's taught engineering and cybersecurity at the United States Naval Academy and has spent time in the private sector, both as a member of boards of directors and as a tech investor. More recently, he was a member of the congressionally chartered Cybersecurity Solarium Commission. It was, in fact, a recommendation of that commission to create an office of the National Cyber Director. Well, NYU, as you all know, is a private university in public service, and we're thrilled to have with us such a consummate public servant. But I'd like to say 2 things at a somewhat more conceptual level about Director Inglis and his public service and why it's particularly appropriate for us that he is spending tonight with us and sharing his thoughts on the cyber social contract. First, at NYU, we regard cybersecurity as a complex interdisciplinary program. Hence, the Center for Cybersecurity, which represents a partnership of the law school and the School of Engineering. Hence, also our Master of Science degree in Cybersecurity Risk and Strategy. And some members of that group are, in fact, with us this evening. Now, that degree program is really an opportunity for NYU to make good on its commitment to interdisciplinarity, seeing as it conjoins tech and policy and strategy and law in the service of a more holistic cybersecurity approach. Now, Director Inglis positively embodies, lives and breathes that interdisciplinary approach. His public service is marked by a willingness to think inside technical domains, but also to think outside them and to regard cybersecurity as not being exclusively defined by technical issues, quite the opposite. So that's one aspect of his public service that I wanted to draw attention to. The other is this. To be an effective public servant, you have to have a sense of the public. To be an effective public servant, you have to be willing to engage the public. And although Director Inglis has served in all sorts of capacities where one might have imagined that engagement was hard to come by, I'm here to tell you, based on my own life experience, that he has consistently come to NYU, to classrooms, and does this routinely across the country, and shared his perspectives and rolls up his sleeves and is willing to engage with all manner of members of the informed public about the issues that are close to his profession. So I regard that as a defining feature of his public service, not just that he's served, but that he's willing and committed to engaging, including most recently through the publication of his very important essay in Foreign Affairs called A Cybersecurity Social Contract. So I could go on, but I've been told by the director himself not to, so I'll take direction well, I hope. And at this point, turn the floor over to Director Chris Inglis. Thank you so much for being here, Chris.
Thank you, Sam. So, and I gather we're going to have several parts. I'm going to give some remarks here. They'll be, to some degree, scripted by this kind of frame of reference I have in my head, but extemporaneous kind of in the end. And then some, perhaps, kind of back and forth between Sam and I, and then hopefully some questions from you. To Sam's last point, which is the essential need of public servants to have public engagement, I typically learn or take as much influence from sessions like this as I might then attempt to wield, and I suspect this will be no different. Right? The students I met with earlier, the questions alone, right, inform my sense as to what the priorities and the values are of the society that we would serve, and that's really the public proposition. I'm going to start my remarks with an anecdote, a joke of sorts. I used to use this kind of in a different context, but I think it can appropriate it for this purpose. Imagine a CEO who really is not kind of strongly invested in the digital infrastructure, cyber, whatever that is. He or she is kind of hoping that problem doesn't come to his or her town, and happens in the cafeteria to see or to meet with the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer. Remembers vaguely at some distance, what that person is supposed to be doing, and hopes to goodness that this person is able to hold these kind of devils at bay. And so asks the following question, is like, I've read all of this about SolarWinds and the Colonial Pipeline and JBL and all that stuff that's happening out there. Are we okay? And the CISO, not having ever had a conversation with this person before, has no idea, no earthly idea where to start in terms of whether they are or they're not okay. And the CEO goes, in a word, are we good? How are we doing? In a word. And the CISO goes, in a word, good. Right? And the CEO, with a great sense of relief, says, well, maybe I can plow on into this conversation, have a further fulsome discussion of how good we're doing. And he goes, is there a more fulsome discussion of this? Is there perhaps a two-word explanation of how we're doing? Yeah, in 2 words, not good. All right. Now that actually, I tell that story because that's actually a pretty good anecdote about where we are in cyberspace. It depends on who you ask and in what context you ask. And at the end of the day, the difference between the good answer or the not good answer is often seen to be a matter of fate. Right? We just happen to arrive at this moment in time, and we're just suffering the consequences that are inevitable from these trends that we can little control. I fundamentally, wholeheartedly disagree with that. I don't think it's fate. I think it's choice. I think that the choices we have made have led this to this moment almost inexorably. And for those that say it's just the way life is in the 21st century, I push back very strongly on that. I would say, no, this is a choice. We have made the choices or failed to make the choices. There's a lot of sins of omissions in this space that have gotten it at this time and place where the digital infrastructure we would depend on for the execution of our personal functions, our kind of professional functions, our national security functions, all of that digital infrastructure has been developed in a way that, having not given time and attention to its inherent resilience, having not given time and attention to how it's actually being employed, having not given time and attention to the doctrine by which we would defend it, we're left with a almost indefensible set of architectures that are not well defended against an adversary that essentially takes advantage of us at every opportunity. That adversary is sometimes complacency. That adversary is sometimes nature. The occasional squirrel chews its way into a kind of electrical grid cage somewhere on the kind of electrical grid and brings that down. Increasingly, that adversary is human beings who understand the value proposition of what this digital infrastructure does for us and holds that at risk for various purposes, but all the same. It's a very attractive proposition to hold us at risk, whether it's for financial gain, whether it's simply for bragging rights, or whether it's in a geopolitical competition to essentially hold us back, deter us, or perhaps even kind of deny, degrade, disrupt the capabilities we would have to hold them at risk. All of that is, I think, a choice that we have made at every turn over the last 40 years. In the Foreign Affairs article that we authored not long ago, we pointed out the kind of almost absurd situation where a single individual can make a single mistake and bring down, right, the confidence of the entire eastern seaboard of the United States. Now, to be sure, I'm talking about the Colonial Pipeline event, where it was a relatively mediocre attack against a not well-defended pipeline, which at the end of the day got into their information technology system, which is the side that does all the administrative work. And because the proprietor didn't know how strongly or well connected that was to the operational technology side, where the valves and the motors and the petroleum lives, they took the kind of safest course of action and said, let's just shut that down. thinking that that was perhaps kind of a save at the end of the day that was a near miss. But what it then did was to cascade into this attack on confidence, where people who thought that perhaps there was some larger kind of risk here, they flooded the gas stations and tried to figure out how to get the last ounce of petroleum or gasoline into their cars before it simply went away. It was an attack on confidence, not by intention, but by effect, that was essentially set up because of the choices that were made or not made along the way. On the other end of the spectrum, you have nation states that kind of careen into this space. North Korea is a nation state that uses cyber as a kind of a money-making proposition, and so you have a criminal enterprise fronting as a government, or vice versa, I'm not sure which. But you have North Korea that essentially will find any open door and try to take advantage of that. And once in a while, they wind up going against a kind of a small concern. Maybe it's a kind of a one-person business somewhere out kind of in the Midwest of the United States that thinks they're a world away from risk. And all of a sudden, they're toe-to-toe with a ransomware attack that's actually prosecuted by a nation state. That's not a fair fight. They couldn't possibly win that fight, right? And why is that? Because we've devolved, right, the responsibility for security to the lowest possible kind of denominator in this case, which is the last tactical mile, the person who happens to inherit, right, all of those choices made or not made about the inherent resilience of that architecture and who's accountable to defend that architecture. Which is why I think we need a new social contract. Which is why I think that this is not a technology issue. This is a doctrinal issue. This is a roles and responsibility issue. To be sure, if we get the roles and responsibilities right, if we declare in this space, as we have in others, who's accountable for what. We've done that in the aviation industry. We've done that in the automobile safety kind of world. We've done that with food, with drugs, with health and safety, a variety of kinds. Declared who is accountable for what in order to guarantee, deliver services that we have confidence in, that have resilience and robustness in them. If we get that doctrine right, we can then make sure that the people, the skilled people, the trained people, the educated people who populate those roles where accountability lies are up to the game, that they understand what their accountability is and they can then kind of stand up to that. And if we get that right, we can then bend technology to our purpose, as opposed to doing it the opposite way, which is we build the technology, we try to figure out how to make people bend to its purpose. Who thinks that Control-Alt-Delete is a clever way to shut down a system? Right? That's bending to technology's purpose. Right? So how do we make it such that we define the doctrine, get the people in the right place, and then define the technology so that it meets society's larger purpose? That's a new social contract that requires us to rethink how we actually get on with the aspirations we had at the dawn of the internet age. I can still remember at the dawn of the internet age, I'm old enough to remember that. My first computer had a whopping 5 megabyte hard drive, 64K of internal memory, worked at a whopping, I think, 4.77 megahertz. That was the speed of the processor. For those of you who don't pay attention to that, that's probably 1,000th of 1% of what your watch can do today, or your iPod, or anything else that you've got. But I can still remember buying one of those for $2,500 in about 1985, 1986, taking it home. It wouldn't connect to an internet because there wasn't any such thing. It only connect to the wall for a power supply. It had a color screen, meaning it had green text on a black background. I wonder today why I bought that, but as I thought about what its future potential was, I was bedazzled by the possibility that this could be the most democratizing force that the planet had ever known. That when this thing was connected, when the internet did come about, when we figured out how to actually combine all of this processing power, but more importantly the data, the systems, the ideas, right? The competition of ideas was going to flourish. I thought it'd be a democratizing force because when this fell into the hands of perhaps those poor downtrodden souls that live in North Korea or other such kind of autocracies, that they would say, I now see the world for what it really is. And kind of this thirst for democracy, this thirst for individual freedom would spring naturally forth, and that they would essentially rise up and essentially become what I thought was the fate of humanity. I think that what we saw over time was that it might just be the opposite. It might be that in the hands of an autocrat, somebody that tries to perceive what divisions exist in society, exacerbate those divisions, drive the kind of the factions that they don't prefer into a corner, perhaps amplify and bring to the fore the factions that they do prefer, that the tailorability, the surgical nature of this could be in their hands something that could be used to strengthen, right, demagogues or autocrats. And we watched that happen in places like Russia and China and North Korea. And I thought with some despair, I might have misjudged this terribly. I must say that in the last month and a half, I've come back to center point that watching this same technology in the hands of President Zelensky have come to the conclusion it might just be that humans still matter. It might just be at the end of the day that we can actually determine our future. We can actually use this technology for those things that we hold as common good, common value, right? In a society that is based upon democratic values and the respect of individuals, it might just be this technology could be used for that purpose. Because the technology in and of itself can't, shouldn't, doesn't define our future. It's the doctrine, it's the people skills that then bend technology to that purpose, all kind of in a place where we say, what are our future aspirations and how do we actually make the necessary investments and the positive choices to accomplish them? So the strategy that I would recommend essentially has three broad components. But there's a fourth that's implicit in this. Let me start with the fourth. The fourth would be, do we know what we wanted the internet to do for us? Do we know what cyberspace was supposed to do for us? And stop measuring our progress by whether we obsess about today's threat or last night's catastrophe, the cleanup on aisle 9. Stop obsessing about that and get on with that positive, compelling vision about what that future should be for us. Now, that's not to say that we should be Pollyannish and ignore the threat, but we should have such a strong commitment to achieving that future that we then commit to making the necessary investments to achieve that future. So if you're going to be serious about using digital infrastructure to achieve personal functions, business functions, national security functions, then you're likely to then make the follow-on decision to say, am I willing to invest in the inherent resilience and robustness of that across technology, across people, across doctrine, right, which is perhaps the hardest part, so that it's then a defensible proposition, that I have some confidence that I can get on and stay on that course. And having made that architecture, which is, again, it's not just a technical architecture, it's technology, people, and doctrine. Having made that architecture, am I then prepared to defend it because it's not secure, not in a world that actually has kind of people in it or has changing conditions in it, but it is defensible. Am I prepared to defend it, which is a human endeavor? And if you're really serious about this, how do you defend that using the optimum condition, which is a collaborative condition, as opposed to a division of effort which says everyone's on their own. Everyone has to defend merely based upon what they know in their cylinder of excellence or what authorities they can bring to bear in their cylinder of excellence. Put another way, how do we make it such that if you're a transgressor in this space, whether you're nature, whether you're incompetence, whether you're complacency, whether you're an actual other human being or a nation state of human beings, if you're a transgressor in this space, how do we force you to beat all of us to beat one of us? That's new. We've not done that before. And then finally, in the last part of the strategy, the first two again being resilience, proactive, collaborative defense, the third part would be, how do we align actions to consequences in this space? How do we make it such that if you've behaved well in this space, you deserve and you will get, right, the meaningful assistance, right, of your kind of sector mates, your teammates, your country mates, or if you're a country in this space that is aligned with other countries, like-minded countries, that will lean in and participate in that collective defense with you, alongside of you. Again, to kind of follow through on the promise that you got to beat all of us to beat one of us. And the last thing in terms of aligning action to consequences in that space is if you behave badly in this space, then you deserve the consequences that are attendant to that as if you behave badly in any other domain of interest. So there'll be legal consequences, financial consequences, accountability, right, needs to be kind of brought to bear upon you. It's not a symmetrical proposition that if you've done something that's cyber-wise the wrong thing, you might not deserve, it might not be appropriate for us to come at you using cyber. This is an instrument of power that essentially affects all other instruments, all other domains. We should therefore use all other domains, all other instruments to affect cyber outcomes. So that's broadly the cyber strategy. But nested right in the middle of that is my fundamental proposition, which is this really is about a doctrinal change. Nothing I've suggested is new or novel. These are ideas that have been around for a very long time. But I don't think that we have as a society committed to resilience by design to actually prevent these events in ways that we must. And I know that we have not as a society committed to a collective, collaborative events that crosses the private-public boundaries. It's just been too hard. It's just been one of those things that we have found ourselves saying, I just don't know how to achieve the degree of professional intimacy in that space that is required to essentially make it such that you got to beat all of us to beat one of us. So why don't we just do it the old-fashioned way, which is, I'll tell you what you need to know, but turns out I never really know what you need to know. I'll tell you ahead of the time you need it, but I never really know when you need it. And I'll tell you those things that, based upon my experience, have some insight about the nature of your situation, which I never quite know. Only when you bring those barriers down and collaborate in the truest sense of the word do I get to a collective defense. And for the first time in our cyber history, at least, We have the legal authority for the lawyers in the room, or the prospective lawyers in the room, which is most of the people. We have the legal authority to establish just such a condition at something called the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, hosted by the Department of Homeland Security. And for those that have said, we've done this before, we haven't. Right? We've had information sharing before, which is not collaboration. We've had shared repositories before, which is not collaboration. We've had any number of opportunities to ask questions of one another or to push information to one another, but we've never had a proposition where we can combine our efforts at the lowest possible level of collaboration, meaning with high granularity, a high degree of time sensitivity, to say, I've got a hunch, you've got a shard, you've got an insight, let's put those together and discover something together that we cannot discover alone. I'll just close with this, which is that there are lessons from history that I think actually are useful at this moment in time, not least of which is our lesson from 9/11. I think I mentioned this several weeks ago in another seminar here on the campus, so I'll be very brief about this. But after 9/11, we thought two things. The first, I think, endures to this day, which is we discovered that garrison is not the same as sanctuary, that we're no longer in a place where our physical isolation based upon oceans can kind of protect us from those threats that would kind of come into our homeland. We might have thought that we discovered that, after kind of Pearl Harbor, but we discovered it in spades on 9/11, right? In ways that we thought were kind of very surprising and horrific, because commercial infrastructure on 9/11 was used to our detriment in a way that shocked and amazed us. The second thing we thought we learned at the time after 9/11 was that we had failed to connect the dots, that we had segmented the world based upon legal jurisdiction, that there was foreign security based upon kind of foreign kind of activities, and that was separate from domestic activities. Why? Well, because U.S. citizens, or U.S. persons, more appropriately, more U.S. persons, are kind of given different privileges, different kind of distinctions in a world than everyone else. And so we had segmented then our response to how do you kind of address threats in those two spaces, as if those spaces essentially met at some clean seam. And so we thought that having prosecuted kind of some sense of what foreign threats were, and prosecuted some sense of what domestic threats were, that somebody had failed to connect the well-formed dots on either side of that divide and failed to come to the conclusion that this thing, this foreign terrorist threat, was in fact bent upon bringing death and destruction to our homeland. Upon further consideration, especially in the years perhaps from 2003 through 2015, I think what we really discovered was not that we had failed to connect the dots, but we'd failed to put our heads together to form dots that nobody could have detected alone, right? And a close examination, right, of the events of 9/11 would show that that is in fact the case, that neither side had a well-formed dot to offer the other, right? The U.S. intelligence community had some sense, a very specific sense, that we were at risk from a foreign terrorist organization, had no idea, no conception, failure of imagination that that might perhaps show up in the homeland. The FBI and other domestic entities were looking closely at the homeland, knew that there were some strange activities taking place. People wanted to learn how to fly airplanes, but didn't want to learn how to land those airplanes, right? And did not imagine that this could be then the kind of the byproduct of some foreign terrorist organization in the abroad. Each of those having a sense, a hunch, a half-formed idea, not comparing that to kind of perhaps reconcile whether this collectively added up to something bigger than one, failed to make a dot, let alone connect a dot. That's true times 10 in cyberspace. Most of us have an insight into this space based upon the physical jurisdiction, the legal jurisdiction that we have, which is typically based on geography, and therefore kind of understand the world in a very small piece part, as if you're looking at a map through a soda straw, and have no idea what's to the left of that or to the right of that. And unless we kind of take those soda straws away and give a common view across that map, we'll not see the things that are coursing ruthlessly across those jurisdictional boundaries, those geographic boundaries. That's true times 10 in cyberspace, and one thing more, which is in the world of terrorism, which I described in some detail for a reason, the government had most of the tools, if not all of the tools, to deal with that. The private sector could generate capacity, perhaps innovation, technology to help the government prosecute that threat, but it was the government that was on point, on the front lines. Cyber is just the opposite. Most of the tools, most of the space, most of the operations are owned, operated, innovated, developed, deployed, delivered by the private sector. The government now finds itself in a situation where it has to support the private sector. It has some unique insights, largely derived of intelligence and other such things. It has some unique authorities, whether it's convening power, diplomatic power, legal power, sanctioning power, but it doesn't have that authority smartly in the private sector so much as it has it adjacent to the private sector. And the government has to figure out at that distance that it enjoys, that logical distance it enjoys, how does it actually deliver that in a supporting fashion to the private sector? Everyone is uncomfortable. That's, I think, as it should be. If we're going to tuggle and tussle with this thing to figure out how to get this right, we have to get to a place where we're uncomfortable, but we stay in the legally right place, not violating privacy or other kind of responsibilities that we have to protect our citizens from all the things the Constitution guarantees. But it is an uncomfortable place. And therefore, I just kind of end where I began, which is this is a doctrinal issue. This is a social contract that requires a fundamental reanalysis of who's accountable for what, how are we accountable to one another, right, to achieve a collective defense that no one of us can deliver on our own, kind of using the authorities that we alone or the insights we alone have. Having said all that, delighted to be with you, and I look forward to your questions and your answers. Right, so, Sam?
Thank you so much, Chris. A little bit of a detour. We'll obviously come back to the main topic at hand, but I think it behooves us to speak a little bit about Ukraine for a second. I know you made mention of it. I was struck by something that Nicole Perlroth, the eminent cybersecurity journalist, writes in the first chapter of her recent book called This Is How the World Ends. She describes Ukraine, this is in the aftermath of a number of significant Russian cyber attacks on that country over the last years. She describes it as Russia's digital test kitchen, a kind of striking and nowadays fairly haunting turn of phrase. Now, I know that in the lead up to the hostilities, there were warnings that were issued that cyber war was about to be unleashed at a scale that had never been seen before. And while I don't want to do too much inferring from what we don't read in headlines, it's a little bit like Sherlock Holmes's dog that didn't bark situation. I think many people are at least offering up thoughts as to why it is that we're not seeing cyber hostility at the scale that had been anticipated. So I wonder if you could just give us a little bit of perspective on how to think about that issue.
Well, first I would observe it's not over till it's over. So we don't know how this is going to play out. We have the benefit of now. We have the benefit of perhaps the last month and a half. We have no benefit of what's going to happen in the next month and a half to 2 months. And I'll get to the question kind of directly in a minute, too. We know that the Russians are pretty dedicated to kind of defining and following doctrine, almost in a kind of in a bullish way. So their traditional doctrine has been lead with disinformation, right? Kind of follow with whatever activities are kind of useful to disunify, confuse, perhaps kind of attack the coordination, command and control, synchronization, or the unity of your adversary. That then almost always results in a cyber attack, which would go after the digital underpinnings of what perhaps kind of unifies you and gives you synchronization, coordination, command and control. We did see both of those play out in the Ukrainian situation. And then follow, if necessary, with kinetic and other activities, but kinetic is what we've seen, kind of those physical activities of one army perhaps kind of attacking a nation state kind of in a very vicious, barbaric way. We've seen all three of those things play out. The question then is if we're in fact a component of what is sustaining the strength, resolve of the Ukrainians, we and or NATO combined. And I suspect it's the latter that we should be thinking of. Why then haven't the Russians turned that on us? Well, they have turned on the disinformation. You know, they've been kind of pushing that very, very strongly. As I indicated earlier, kind of Zelensky and others have, I think, been masterful in essentially fighting fire with fire. They have a more powerful idea, a better idea, a transcendent idea, which is this unity of effort purpose and this kind of sense that a democracy is worth defending even in the 21st century. Has, I think, not so much blunted, but given a counter view, a counter punch, right, to the disinformation that the Russians would kind of aim at us. To be sure, there's a lot of different disinformation taking place within the Russian landmass, and I think he's still very popular. Putin is very popular there, but it's not working on the rest of us, and I'm greatly cheered by that. As to whether they would follow with a cyber attack or a series of cyber attacks on the West, that is a bit of a mystery. Right? We had every expectation that they might do that, because there's a sense that it's reversible, it's below the use of force. It doesn't then call into question kind of an Article 5 in NATO. But there are several reasons why that might not happen yet. They might think that we're 10 feet tall, and maybe we're 9'6", but they might think that we're 10 feet tall, and they might not want to trip a response from us that would then they would live to regret. It might be that they're busy, right? That their hands are full doing what they're already doing, and they have their capacity limited. As much as we think that they're very, very proficient and well practiced in this, they've got their hands full. They certainly had their hands full in the kinetic fight, the physical fight, and I suspect they have their hands full in a combination of what they're trying to do to the Ukrainian landmass, as well as trying to ward off, this kind of largely crowdsourced activity, which is doing denial of service attacks and all manner of things to perhaps distract them kind of in the larger milieu. Three, I think that they themselves would worry about escalating this situation because they don't want this to kind of be a head-on-head contest with the West. They would like to kind of secure some victory in the Ukraine, to be sure. They would like to do that with minimum cost to themselves, which they're perhaps at this point understanding is not what they had imagined. They don't want to widen this, and therefore what I offered as they might think that this is reversible and below the use of force, they're not entirely certain, and they therefore might not want to hazard that reaction on their part. That being said, I think that there might not be an off-ramp for Vladimir Putin that he's aware of, that he'd be comfortable with at this point. And therefore, we have to imagine that he might get to a place where he's desperate and he has to do something more, perhaps kind of in the old kind of edict to escalate to de-escalate. And one of the principal tools that he could bring to bear would be cyber attacks, and we have to therefore be prepared for that. The president today kind of announced some information that the United States wanted to make sure that the American public and NATO allies had, that was we're mindful that that's a distinct possibility. And we have some sense of the shape and form of that because we know something about Russian doctrine. And therefore, we're kind of in a moment where having kind of delivered that strategic warning that we should all be forewarned, we're in a place where we can then do something about that, which is how do we prepare to make sure that we're resilient and robust? To some degree, we can kind of do better than we have. How do we prepare to make sure we're on the front balls of our feet and an ability to detect it as it comes on, if it comes on? How do we make sure that we're joined up in a collaboration, right, such that we can kind of make the proposition, you got to beat all of us to beat one of us? And how do we prepare to actually kind of work through, fight through, right, kind of architectures or systems that are not perfect, that are not running at full tilt? But how do we get to a place where we don't have the response to a colonial pipeline in the future that we did in the past? That we have sufficient confidence in this, that we'll weather this storm, that breathing through our nose, we're just essentially working straight forward, straight ahead. I wish I knew more, but I would tell you that my experience in the intelligence community is that we're typically good at secrets, terrible at mysteries, and this is a bit of a mystery. So,
turning now to the cyber social contract. So you began by saying that where we are now is the product of a series of choices, not fate. I guess with the idea that we could reverse those choices or make different choices going forward with a different result. I wonder if it's not too semantic and law professor of me to suggest, I wonder if you could comment on the following. By choice, what you really mean is a combination of market forces on the one hand and a regulatory vacuum on the other. And that by doctrine, when you say what we need is a change in doctrine, what you mean is we need a new regulatory architecture of some sort, or a series of regulations across probably a range of agencies. Is that roughly speaking what you're calling for?
Roughly. I would nuance this a bit, and I think with reasonable effect. One, I think that self-enlightenment is going to take us a certain distance. There is some of that taking place now. Right? You see some even CEOs are saying, I get this, this is about us, this is about me, as opposed to there are champions in the world who simply haven't done their job and they should be out there defending us. I do worry a lot about what I would describe as willful ambivalence. A lot of people looking at this saying something's gone wrong in this space, who's going to fix it? Right? Well, everyone, every organization, every sector, every government has a role or responsibility to play. So self-enlightenment is going to get you some distance. Market forces should then, if they kind of realize that this is something that affects all of us, and if we get the social contract right, that says that we're all liable to participate in our own defense to some degree. We've done that kind of even with cars. You lock your car, you don't put an iPad on the dash when you walk away from it. You kind of make sure you park it under a streetlight if you have half a chance. Right? You take a meaningful role in your own safety in the private sector. How do we get to that place kind of in this? So market forces, I think, can perhaps kind of cause companies to kind of understand that they're going to be liable if they don't, or they're going to be more competitive if they do. But at the end of the day, you're right. We're going to get to a place where we say, what remains is a set of non-discretionary kind of attributes, features, and roles and responsibilities to include attendant accountability. What remains is something that's simply not discretionary, and we're going to have to stand in and do as we have done in so many other domains of interest to say, we're therefore going to require that this be the case, possibly through regulation, sometimes through legislation, but a combination of those two. And we have experienced that already in the automobile industry, in the aviation industry, in the food and kind of drug industry. All of those have been places where at some point we said, what remains after self-enlightenment and market forces is not discretionary, and we therefore need to stand in, as the government must, right, in order to secure the common defense for the benefit of the people that it would serve and support. The government's going to stand in. Having said that, we need to make sure that we do that by exception. We do that with a surgical, light touch, not lead with that. It's not the first thing out of the box, but at some point I think we will get to that place.
Let me ask a kind of more specific question about the market and regulation with a focus on big tech. So big tech is on the one hand the pride and joy of American innovation. It represents the best of what this country is capable of doing, and the market dominance of the devices and the software and the platforms that have been created in this country are the envy of the world. On the other hand, those same companies that have had this outside success show up on the radar screens of various regulators and lawmakers as problems that need to be solved. All manner of problems, but to state the obvious one, the bigness problem and others like it. In a world in which you're going to need to enlist the collaboration of public and private, how are you going to get the balance right when it comes to this particular, but obviously very important part of the private sector?
Yeah, leaving aside the kind of the secondary question of whether there's a size that makes it too big, all right, and we have to actually attack that. I would say, leaving that aside, that I don't see so much big tech as sometimes equating to a burden or a challenge or kind of something that is causing, having a malign influence, but rather as a leverage point, right, as a resource. That if it were to focus on these societal great goods, it could deliver at scale things that can't be done, by any other kind of similarly kind of postured mechanism within our society, right? Microsoft 3 weeks ago, I think, talked about how they detected on a given afternoon some threat that was holding Ukrainians at risk. I think it was a wiper virus. Diagnosed it within 3 hours and deployed a solution within 3 hours to 400 million endpoints across the world. That's extraordinary. And imagine if we did that in the design phase. If we said, and that's not to say that Microsoft wouldn't naturally do that in the design phase, this was something caught late in the game, but imagine we did that in the design phase and we deploy to kind of every place where that technology shows up, something that is resilient by design. It's not something that is possibly defendable, but it's your problem as to whether you defend it or not. We've essentially allocated the kind of the risk prevention, the risk mitigation in the capital expenditure phase to a component that was in a place where it could meaningfully take on that responsibility and deliver on it. That's what I think we ought to be thinking our way through. And if they did that, I think that there is market potential for them that's in excess of perhaps what we even exist today. So it's not so much that it is a burden without benefit to both sides. There's a benefit to the consumers, there's a benefit to the provider. The provider essentially is more competitive. The provider essentially can operate in like-minded countries, with greater confidence that they're the preferred choice. Now that's a bit of a optimistic kind of cast on it, but this isn't something that I would say we have to impose this burden on the private sector, slow them down. We do not want to kill the innovation engine. We don't want to kill the capacity and scale that is the envy, right, of the world. We want to sustain that. but we want to make sure that it includes these great goods that have been included in other industries of some consequence. So.
I highly recommend everyone read this article that you've written, which is very subtle and very important. One of the things I took away from it is that you have a view, and maybe I'm drawing the wrong inference, in which case set me straight. But it seemed to me anyway that you had the view that first comes robust cybersecurity, ideally accomplished through the collaborative model that you set out, the new cyber social contract. And then with mature cybersecurity comes the possibility of an American equivalent to the European privacy regulation, the GDPR. So I thought that was striking because I think we have a tendency, especially those of us who are lawyers or soon to be lawyers, to think that privacy and cybersecurity are synonymous, or that privacy ought to be driving cybersecurity and not vice versa. But it struck me that maybe the opposite was true in how at least you were framing the issue. So did I get that right? And if so, maybe...
I think it did. And it's an assertion more than a proven fact, right? I think that if cybersecurity, remember Jeff Moss, right, the guy of DEF CON and Black Hat fame, and I think I mentioned this in the seminar a few weeks ago, when he says in his talks, as he so often does, why do race cars have bigger brakes? So they can go faster. They don't have bigger brakes because the brake manufacturers want something to brag about. They have bigger brakes for some mission purpose. Cyber needs to be considered in the same context. Why do we have cyber or cybersecurity? We have it so that we can accomplish our missions. If that's the case, then cyber should be expected to help us deliver on our aspirations. What are the personal pursuits that we want to use this digital infrastructure for? What are the business pursuits? What are the national security pursuits? Do we want to defend privacy using digital infrastructure or make sure that it is not held at risk when we use digital infrastructure? Cybersecurity should be put in the position where it has to deliver that, therefore kind of hold that as another attribute that we need to kind of double down on to say, how do we build our systems so that they actually reasonably protect privacy or have some confidence that we can essentially not hold it at risk? So I think the proposition is cyber should be supportive. It should prostrate itself at the altar of privacy as opposed to the other way around.
Does the social contract that you envision scale internationally? And if so, at the level of what you're calling, I think, enlightenment or like mindset shift, or is there some kind of more concrete, dare I say it, kind of regulatory intervention you could imagine that would essentially create that level of scale?
Yeah, I think there'll be some scaling limitations given kind of the differences between various societies and their kind of propensity to sometimes align privacy and security in different ways. But underneath of it, there are common value systems across what I would describe as, the allies in the United States, kind of whether it's, the former or the latter, but, they're combined in their kind of desire at this point in time to protect what we know as democratic rule, right? I think that the common values underpinning that are sufficiently strong that I think this can and must scale across an international community as opposed to being something held within one community. Why? Because when I describe a collective defense, it works best in the largest possible kind of venue. If it's a collective defense that only involves federal kind of responders, right? Well, that's perhaps better than what we've been doing. If it's a collective defense that involves federal responders and private sector responders, that's better still. If it's a collective defense that involves all of the individuals and organizations who don't think they have a cyber job, but they can participate in their own cyber defense, that's better still. If it's a cyber defense that essentially kind of implicates nations plural, that's even better still. Right? And so I think that we need to get this in the largest possible venue and understand that at some point there'll be some scaling problems that we can't go the distance we might prefer, at least in the short term. I don't think GDPR is kind of philosophically kind of at odds with what the United States would hold as values. It's just the kind of scaling mechanism that they've got on that might not be the same as we would have chosen.
We seem to have chosen, speaking of prior choices, a more sector-specific approach to regulation. I guess some people are of the view that seeing as we've made that choice and we've decided to regulate in a way that makes sense to the financial services community or to the provision of healthcare, that it's unrealistic to expect a comprehensive, trans-substantive form of regulation.
Yeah, so regulation has to have attachment points. And so at some point, if you're regulating a critical function, the responsibility has to be attached to some specific person or organization. And those organizations are typically defined not by the cross-cutting functions, but rather more often than not by their placement in a sector. So the regulation likely is going to still be, right, how do you regulate entities that happen to live within an energy sector or finance sector or a transportation sector? We defined 16 sectors, in 1999? And those have been reasonably kind of solid, helpful, even to this day. I think what we realize, though, is that critical functions perhaps are the coin of the realm. That's where the traction, that's where the rubber hits the road. And so we're going to have to increasingly think kind of horizontally cutting across those sectors to say, how do you become something that we say is critical enough that we want to stand in and kind of define your attributes? And it's probably because you lie across one of those threads of some critical function that we've defined that cuts across that. Think of the economy. The economy is not dependent just upon, right, financial transactions or the financial sector. It's dependent upon the provision of telecommunications that allows those kind of communications, those transactions to flow back and forth. It's dependent upon the flow of electricity. It's dependent upon water supplies, which are essential to the conduct of the electrical sector, and so on and so forth. If we were to do a continuity of the economy exercise and draw that thread, we'd find a number of nodes along the way. We'd say, this is important, this is important, this is important. And when we then attach, right, some expectation of performance to those, we would find that we were reaching into discrete sectors, the verticals inside of that. I know that sounds too complicated by half, but we're describing the real world. That's the way I think it's actually going to work. And so I think that we will have both, right? The horizontal is going to be the most important way to think about it when you're talking about the result. But in terms of setting up the transactions for potential success, you're going to be thinking about the verticals, right? The sector by sector approach.
Maybe as good a time as any to put the room on notice that I'm sure Director Inglis would welcome your questions shortly. I've just got a couple more that I wanted to tick off before I turn the floor over to the resident experts here. Forgive me the sports metaphor, I guess. Can't possibly have a conversation like this without a sports metaphor. Are you the defensive coordinator of American cybersecurity? Is that how you conceptualize this role? The idea being that your friends in your old place of employment would be the offensive coordinator, and the president, I suppose, is the head coach of the whole affair. But is that how you model the function of the NCD?
It's unfortunately more complicated than that. So Jen Easterly, right, and I have described ourselves kind of when we're together, when we're apart, but not least of which when we kind of testify before kind of our legislators, as quarterback and coach respectively, for defensive purposes. So Jen's the on-the-field quarterback, essentially ensuring that for defensive...
Wait, hold on a second. She's the defensive quarterback? Now you really lost me.
That's right.
Okay.
So let me describe it this way. Let me come to that question second. Okay. Let me first say that there's certain things we do to guarantee our kind of cyber outcomes. Certain things we do inside cyberspace that we would describe as defensive in nature. How do we make that space more resilient and robust? Defense. How do we actually proactively understand how those architectures are being used? Technology, people, and doctrine. Defense. How do we make sure that if we find something inside that architecture that shouldn't be there, we box it, corral it, evict it, get it out of there? Defense. How do we make sure we enable the private sector, which is doing similar activities across infrastructure that they operate? How do we make sure that we're collaborating with them to ensure that they have what we have at a time when they can action it? Granular, timely, surgical information. Defense. All of those things, I would say, that happen inside cyberspace require no small amount of coordination, no small amount of role assignment across a diverse array of organizations and people. Jenny Easterly is the on-the-field quarterback for all of those activities to ensure that that work gets done. But it's defense. I'm the coach that makes sure that we've actually assigned those roles, that the various parties who have those roles understand those roles, that those roles are designed to be complementary in an execution that they are actually complementary. So when you look at the strategic intent that we wrote out of my office in the late October timeframe, we kind of had four big kind of to-dos. Coherence. How do we develop and deliver federal coherence? That includes how we actually own, operate, manage our own infrastructure, but more importantly, how do we deal with each other? How do we deal with the private sector? 2, drive public-private collaboration. Defense. 3, how do we do performance assessment? How do we actually understand that all of that adds up to something that's an optimal application of resource in a world that's constrained with that resource? So how do we assess the result? And then 4, resilience, future resilience, especially future resilience. How do we double down on investing in technology, people, and doctrine defense? Now that leaves kind of then who is using the instruments of power outside of cyberspace to bring about desired conditions inside of cyberspace. That's traditionally the role of the National Security Council. And so you point to kind of my old organization up at Fort Meade, which might be a mix of NSA and kind of US Cyber Command. I was in the former, not the latter. Those are 2 instruments that live typically kind of in a world which is going to kind of traditionally be those things where we traverse architectures or hold at risk architectures that are outside of the cyberspace that we legitimately own, that we're legitimately responsible for. So I would put those in the realm of National Security Council should be understanding how we employ those instruments of power. Similarly, diplomacy outside the realm of things that we can literally say are inside the cyberspace domain where defenders essentially have those tools. Financial sanctions, legal kind of remedies. All of those things are the traditional kind of tools of power used by the National Security Council to bring about conditions in various domains of interest. Cyber is one of those domains of interest. And so that's a natural kind of assignment of responsibility to the National Security Council, which might look a little bit like offense on some of those kind of occasions. But for the most part, is simply the use of tools outside of cyberspace to bring about desired conditions inside cyberspace. I'm inside cyberspace. Let me say one thing further, which is we have a US Defense Department for a reason. It's not the US Department of War. It used to be the Department of War until the late 1800s, I think. But we kind of moved off of that and said, you know, what we do that looks offensive in nature is a natural extension of defense. Now, I'm not trying to be too clever by half. Right? We do not, though, go around trying to cause disruption, chaos, kind of, the loss of life, for its own sake. We use that as an extreme extension, right, of defense, right? That when push comes to shove and we have to defend ourselves by using offensive activities, that we're prepared to do that. Hopefully it's a deterrent kind of effect. But if push comes to shove and we have to do it, we do it. I think that we need to think about the tools in cyberspace the same way. Right, that we use those for the purposes of extending defense to take our legitimate interest in defending our people, our way of life, our allies. We use those as an extension of that. But to the extent that that's outside kind of those things that are tools that are under the control of people inside cyberspace, it's controlled by somebody else. Does that answer the question?
It answers the question. Forgive me if I tell you also that I thought of a different sports metaphor while you were talking, riffing off of George Will's immemorial observation about baseball, that baseball is the only game where the defense starts with the ball.
That's true.
Maybe that bears some kind of affinity to what you're talking about. Okay, questions from the room?
Yes,
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi again. So you were just talking, what you were just talking about, is that the defend forward sort of strategy that you see coming from DOD? I want to make sure I'm on the same page as you.
So let me talk about defend forward. I think yes, and so the defend forward strategy are offered by the Defense Department, about 2018 or so it's been with us for about 4 years, essentially said the following, which is that if something is holding us at risk in and through cyberspace, we have the responsibility, the right to essentially understand it by being as far forward, persistent engagement as is possible to perhaps understand it in the incipient phase, so that we might then defend forward, right, to achieve the highest possible leverage in essentially interdicting that threat. Now, the important piece of that proposition is that it's a defensive activity, right? It's got to be against a legitimate threat that is holding us at risk. It's not even preemptive. It's essentially saying, if it's a legitimate risk, I want to meet it in the place where I have the highest possible leverage. That's not new and novel, right? We do that with NATO, forward deployed troops. We do that with kind of similar troops that are deployed to the South Korean landmass. We do that with diplomacy, to be as far forward as possible, understanding through our diplomats what's the nature of the world, what's the nature of threats or opportunities, such that we can engage them with the highest possible leverage as far forward as possible. We do that with legal remedies. We're doing that with financial remedies. In a world where we have allies, we try to extend, right, that kind of fabric of our defense as far forward as possible and allow our allies to do the same, right, such that we're kind of participating in a common defense. So I don't think that we should think about cyber's kind of the Cyber Command or the U.S. Department of Defense's persistent engagement or forward defense as new and novel. It's merely an application of an old kind of tactic using kind of this new and novel technique, right, known as cyber. But we should apply all of our instruments in the same way. Early engagement, right? Kind of high leverage, right? So that we can kind of corral these threats at the earliest possible moment. Yes, sir.
For Professor Roscoff's seminar this week, we read a law review article that in part talked about the definition of violence as it pertains to informational warfare and cyber warfare. I'm wondering kind of what your thoughts are on on defining such attacks as violence and how that would affect cyber policy.
Can you give me the 10-second answer of what the article said?
Yeah, the article, it sort of bounced around a few different ideas, but it said that we should be considering some informational warfare to be violence if it causes a violent reaction among the populace.
I see. And so it was still measured, though, on the effect as opposed to constituting perhaps a relationship or an analogy with something that didn't have a real-world kind of effect attached to it.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think so.
So I think there's merit to that. Not having read or perhaps not remembering the article that you've just described, I think there's something to that. Right? We've long held that you can't scream fire in a crowded theater when you know that people are going to stampede the exits and kind of somebody's going to be killed. That there's such a thing as hate speech. There's such a thing as using kind of those words or ideas in a way that brings about physical harm to somebody else. So I think it's measured on the effect, right, and possibly then kind of amplified by the intent. But at the end of the day, you have to actually measure them on a level playing field with what you would then kind of say are kind of similar hazards that come from other kind of mechanisms. So I do think there's something to it. I'll leave it to the lawyers to essentially navigate the space.
So one thing that I have to imagine complicates your job is the fact that some of the bad actors that we're dealing with are independent actors and others are state-sponsored entities, and it may be very difficult at times to disambiguate between the two. So my question is, to what extent do we pursue different strategies, particularly offensive ones, with respect to state-sponsored organizations of cyber warfare versus independent criminal organizations? And then separately, to what extent should or do we entertain sort of plausible deniability on behalf of states like Russia or North Korea when it comes to these organizations that are operating in the shadows but clearly funded by state regimes?
Yeah, so those two typically converge when you're talking about the latter group, particularly North Korea. But I would say that you have to distinguish between whether you're dealing with a nation state that has the full panoply of nation state capabilities, authorities, and the ability to represent the population of interest, or whether you're dealing with a truly criminal enterprise, right? So in the case of a truly criminal enterprise that is not one and the same as a nation state, then you have to consider it as just that. It's a criminal enterprise, and there are kind of remedies and instruments that we bring to bear to try to find, isolate, and to bring them to justice, right? And those need to be consistent with the European model, necessity and proportionality, right? So you can't overreact, and you can't perhaps do something that is disproportionate to the harm that they're bringing against you. Having said that, when you're dealing with a nation state that has the full panoply of kind of resources, but more importantly represents a population of interest, then there's a certain kind of traditional, and instantiated sometimes in policy and law, there's a certain way to deal with them in terms of how you then kind of bring your arguments to bear and how you then bring your influence to bear and the coalitions that you would bring to bear. But it's a different dance, right? And a really important one to essentially fully bring through. Because it just may be that they're representing the will of their people. In some cases they're not, but it just might be. The really interesting place is that kind of halfway house in between, where you have at least the tacit agreement, if not the kind of perhaps direct support, right, of a criminal group that's harbored right in the near abroad of one of those, or maybe right in the backyard of one of those. What do you do about that? And we're negotiating kind of with ourselves this middle space of how do you bring that to the attention of what we think is the offending government that has failed to take action or perhaps might be taking action that you would not prefer? How do you bring that to their attention to say, we're going to give you the first opportunity to help fix this. We're going to at the same time use all of those kind of methods and means that we can to find and attach instruments to those individuals. Legal remedies, if we catch them somewhere, we'll arrest them. Kind of if we find their money somewhere, we'll kind of confiscate it. If we can ban them from travel, we'll do all of, we're going to bring all of that to bear on them, but we're then appealing at the same time to the nation state and saying, if you can help us, right, this actually could go better, and you'll kind of get some street cred with us in terms of being kind of not a like-minded nation, but a nation that has dealt responsibly with us, and we will respond, of course, in kind. What lies beyond that in terms of then holding that nation accountable for the actions taken by citizens of another nation or kind of citizens of their own that are not operating under the direct control of those, that's gray territory. We don't quite know what to do about that yet. We haven't crossed the line yet to say, we are then going to go a little bit further to say, we hold you explicitly, expressly accountable for that, and therefore will bring some consequences to bear on the nation state that happens to harbor or not to kind of take action to disrupt this other group of people. It's a really interesting legal theory to be prosecuted there if you want to take that on. So.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
You talk about rewarding good behavior, punishing bad behavior, and I kind of see a separation between the data security space, like a stolen credit card, and the critical infrastructure space of the Colonial Pipelines. My sense is that in the data security space, there's a lot of punishing bad behavior, whether it's through federal regulatory enforcement or private lawsuits, whereas in the critical infrastructure space, it's a lot of carrots, more rewarding good behavior, encouraging cooperation with the government in particular. As you see the desirability of increasing public-private cooperation, do you also see the possibility, desirability, or tension in adding more sticks in that latter realm, in the critical infrastructure realm? And if so, how do you foresee that working?
Yeah, so I mentioned both, but perhaps was too sly by half in emphasizing the second, right, which is the kind of stick aspect of it. Remember the old joke about why you have the carrot? You have the carrot so you get them close enough to hit them with the stick, right? But I don't mean that. So I would say that you have to do both, right? So I don't think we've done enough of each, right? So let's talk about a recent bill passed, the intrusion reporting bill, right, which requires that, you know, certain companies that are engaged in critical activities, if they have an intrusion, report that to the federal government. It's really, really, really important to define in the rulemaking period who are the expected beneficiaries of that. It's not the federal government. It should be that the expected beneficiaries are the private sector, largely where these activities take place. So we want to acquire that information so we can achieve the status of a FEMA, right? Which is that we're going to respond in some way, shape, or form to this kind of storm or this activity. And what we need is a National Weather Service to essentially tell us where the intensity of the storm is. What are the things that are worthy of our time and attention? So if we're going to propose that the beneficiaries be the private sector, we collect this information for their benefit, then that shapes and forms everything that we do with that. But that's really about getting the first part right. If you behave well in this space, you deserve our material assistance. And maybe at some point in the future, we say, if you behave well in this space, we'll give you some liability protection. Right? We're not going to come find and stab the wounded, but that's not on the table at this moment in time. We don't know quite how to do that. To the second piece of how do we then impose consequences on those who behave badly, we've spoken at some point in this talk about that. How do you find the criminals? How do you hold at risk, right, other nation states that are holding us at risk in and through cyberspace? There's any number of remedies to do that. There are financial sanctions, legal remedies, there's diplomacy, there's public shaming that sometimes works. But all of those are meant to kind of impose a cost or a consequence on a bad actor in this space. But we're not going to shoot our way out of this, right? We cannot just do that and expect that all the other things that I described, right, are going to come along free for the ride. You have to build in resilience, be a harder target. You have to actually proactively understand how these systems are being used, find an anomaly, interdict it, engage it, stop it at the earliest possible moment, assist those who need assistance in this space, and then finally, as a complement to all of that, impose consequences on those who continue to hold you at risk. That only can work in the context of all those other things. Yes, sir.
Quick follow-up. I'm curious about consequences for Colonial Pipeline itself, not the nation states that are.
Well, the question is, did Colonial Pipeline, the proprietor, the vendor, fail to do something that they were reasonably expected to do? Now, their shareholders might kind of say that, the market forces might say that, but it turns out that at that time there weren't any regulations explicitly kind of designated on them that they failed to meet. Now, is that a sin of omission or commission? It's probably the former, not the latter. Right? So subsequent to that the TSA, which Transportation Safety Agency, which regulates pipelines, has essentially articulated requirements for pipeline owners I think in 2 rounds. The details at this point are kind of, but beyond me, but has articulated 2 sets of requirements for which there then should be some accountability and some consequences if they fail to do that. So we're getting our house in order in terms of saying, well, let's specify those things that we expect to be done, and therefore then hold accountable those parties to do that. There was a question in the back.
Hi, so you've noted the presence of technologically savvy global competitors in China, Russia, and North Korea, who I think also have very different value systems for privacy and security. And you've also noted the importance of the private sector in making cyber defense possible. And so I'm wondering, if these countries, the competitors, are more able to impose regulation, to compel their quote-unquote private companies to provide the technologies that they're developing for government purposes, if, in a long-term sense, the U.S. is at a strategic disadvantage when trying to compete with those kinds of adversaries?
It depends. It depends on what you're defending. If what you're defending is the mere kind of success of a revenue kind of oriented sector, the private sector, and I'm not about to suggest that there's anything wrong with that. It's actually a huge benefit to us that the capitalist kind of market forces have done what they've done, largely for the benefit, scope, and scale of kind of bringing kind of the kind of technology, commodity technology we have. But if your only purpose is revenue enhancement, then I think you're kind of in a race to the bottom. If you kind of say that hand in glove with that, you have to defend the values of your society. You have to make sure that you're defending privacy, respect for individuals, the right of individuals to pursue, right, those things that they find interesting to themselves, their own kind of aspects. Then if you're trying to defend that, then there is a real competition between these 2 kind of camps, right? And I would say that if you kind of take a look at what the current leadership of China and Russia, add in kind of North Korea and Iran, they do not have a contract or compact with their people that would essentially guarantee them the kind of individual rights, privacy, freedom, liberty that we describe in our own Constitution. They have a contract of sorts with their people that essentially they kind of seem to be satisfied with, which is, I'll guarantee you some degree of kind of territorial integrity, national pride, economic viability, but they'll stop short of saying, I'll guarantee you the right to privacy, respect, and kind of your individual freedoms. So if that's what we're defending here, then we need to make sure that we keep that foremost in front of ourselves to say, how do we have an economy and a set of industries or kind of entities within that deliver not just kind of those things that you might measure on a spreadsheet or on Wall Street, but at the same time sustain and defend those values of interest. And if that's the issue, then we might have to, on occasion, say, I'm going to constrain my appetite for a low-priced commodity that comes from some other place in reasonable deference to the sustainment of my ability to defend the privacy interest or the liberty interest of my citizens. Case in point, right? One of the reasons that we were remain concerned about the likes of a Kaspersky or others kind of showing up, at least in our critical infrastructure, if not our federal infrastructure, is not so much because we have found a smoking gun in that architecture that some foreign nation would essentially use to kind of hold us at risk by stealing our data or maybe even coming back in and doing a denial of service or computer network attack. It's that the information that they can access using that entree into our critical systems is subject to a legal regime within another nation state that doesn't follow the same rules, right, that we would follow, right? So I'm well familiar with 30 years in the intelligence community. If the U.S. government wants to acquire information about something that we hold to be the possession, the privacy interest of an individual, you have to have probable cause. There's a pretty high standard. It's not an unattainable standard, but the Fourth Amendment's got a pretty high bar associated with it. If some other entity, say a nation state, can insert technology into your ecosphere and acquire information from that using a fundamentally different standard about what they have to prove in order to acquire that information about you, that's a problem. Right? And we ought to therefore be willing to say, I will substitute a technology that is beholden, right, to the kind of the rules, the permissions that we prefer, even if that's going to cost me something in the financial scheme of things. I wish I could say that more succinctly, but at the end of the day, it's a contest of values as much or more as kind of the economic kind of juggernaut of one side or the other. Yes, ma'am, follow up.
Sorry, I guess to put a point on it, not just in a market sense, but in like a conflict as in a cyber warfare sense. I guess I'm thinking about this in terms of like development of technology for warfare purposes, whether that becomes a strategic disadvantage, that we have these encumbrances that are important to us because of our values, but are not so important to our adversaries and thus allow them to maybe move more agilely.
Yes, well, there's a point there, which is that if you're willing to indiscriminately bomb, right, another society's kind of civilian population hiding out in a movie theater or in a hospital, right, the question is whether we're at a disadvantage because we won't do that in return to them, or are we in the better place because we're defending something that is kind of sacrosanct, that we will not defend innocent civilians, we will not attack innocent civilians, we will not hold at risk critical infrastructure. And so when you ask yourself that question, we're at a disadvantage because they're willing to do things we're not. But at the end of the day, do we want to essentially remove that distinction between these two societies and say we're going to do tit for tat? I think that we have long ago decided that we won't, right? And if that places us at a certain disadvantage with respect to those tactics, then the strategic competition is enjoined, and we have to determine whether a society that's based upon the values and the mores that we are will prevail over a society like the one we're witnessing kind of in the Ukraine. And I think our bet is that we will prevail, though it's horrific in the kind of the intermediate spaces to see what they're willing to do that we're not willing to counter or to see others counter, kind of using the same methods. It's the same in cyberspace. Yes, ma'am.
So China has been rather strategic in their use of the BRI, and specifically the Digital Silk Road, to expand their scope over other countries who are just trying to build their cyber infrastructure, and they're using diplomacy, financial services to help these countries gain the infrastructure, the education, the personnel, the bandwidth. How do you think the U.S. should go forward in our future role of working against that to internationally also expand our own scope, so that hopefully potentially it helps protect our security interests as well, and we can keep a democratic and free cyberspace in places like Africa, Southeast Asia, South America?
And
Yeah, so-
Chris, can I interrupt for a second? Maybe before you answer that question, do you want to take a second question as well, and we'll call these the
great.
final two?
Got it.
Gentleman in the back there, yeah.
Just going back to the critical infrastructure discussion we're having, there's a lot of discussion around private industry that owns critical infrastructure, and they have a level of accountability, whether it's to the SEC or a state regulator, but more looking at critical infrastructure that's owned by public municipalities. And there's a lot of those that are small to medium. And what is it that we can do from a national point of view to help build their cyber defences? And is something like CISA and Jen Easley's organisation the one that can help accelerate building their cyber defences?
Good. Okay, great. Let me take those two questions in turn. On the question about China, the One Belt, One Road initiative, there's nothing ennoble about level kind of playing field competition between kind of various industries that might have a national origin that differ. One of the first problems with respect to that is they're not on a level playing field. The government has participated in some of those markets in ways that we find kind of they're egregious, right, in terms of theft of intellectual property, the use of that intellectual property to then kind of offer deals based upon kind of knowledge that we would say is kind of an insider trading deal, or to kind of invest government monies in a private entity such that they're kind of giving you an unrealistic price simply to steal the market share. There are kind of courts around the world that adjudicate these things all day, every day, and say, look, we're going to kind of try to get the level playing field. Second concern there that we have is that even on a level playing field, we have to kind of consider the package, not just of the technology, but of the value system that goes with that package. We spoke earlier about, right, if kind of the insertion of a particular kind of technology into your infrastructure then allows a government to access the information inside of that for kind of using standards, legal standards that you find inappropriate, you need to consider that when you're actually buying into that architecture, say, am I willing to buy that package? I get the whole of that package. Having said all of that, we need to offer an alternative, right? An alternative needs to have two pieces. Viable technology that can work at scope and scale. The United States has proven itself long able to do that. We need to fill this space with similar stuff. Or like-minded nations, right? We don't need to onshore it, but we need to sometimes reshore it. And at the same time, make sure it goes hand in glove with values, right, that endure, that are kind of mutually respectful, not just of the providers, but of the, the consumers at the end of that. In terms of building cyber defenses and critical infrastructure that is often an arm's length away from the federal government, most of it, of course, is not owned, operated by the federal government. Most of it is not even owned by state or local governments. It's all in the private sector. I think we have to do several things. The first is we need to define what it is, right? And so it turns out that there's not one common definition or list that would say what is critical and therefore worthy of additional time and energy. President Biden was given, I think, some unfair criticism when he suggested to Vladimir Putin that there are 16 things you shouldn't attack. What he did was to essentially describe the 16 sectors that we have known since 1990 that contain critical infrastructure. Essentially what he said was, don't attack anything, right? But that in execution, if we're to then kind of take the precious resources we have and try to robust, right, the critical infrastructure across those 16 sectors, we don't have a granular enough definition to know what that is. Because not everything in the financial sector can be of equal importance. And as much as I would regret to say this, there are probably some relatively small concerns in the heat of the battle. We should say, you're unfortunately at the end of the list because there are some things that are at the front of the list in terms of kind of making sure the economy doesn't go down. So we need a process by which we can say, how do we define what critical is and then execute that in a repeated, as regular, as right as rain, so we can focus the resources on the things in priority order. And typically, I think, while we do that sector by sector, as I suggested earlier, we probably should cut across the sectors to say what are the critical functions that then cut across finance, energy, water, transportation, telecommunications, and say if you show up on that thread, you're critical enough. Having said that, we then need a combination between the federal government, state and local governments, but the private sector, to say we need to now have kind of a compact between us to say how do we actually up our game in that regard. We need to make things critical or resilient by design, right? So there's got to be an expectation you're going to build some of this stuff in. The great shame of Log4j was not that we couldn't respond to it and find it. If you don't know what that is, that's a kind of a set of software that's open source, generated by kind of all the programmers in the world, and therefore kind of sharedware. And the great shame wasn't that we couldn't find it. We're finding it. The great shame was there was no time and attention given as it was being created to its inherent resilience and robustness. We should levy that expectation, not on the provider, not on the consumers who ultimately make use of it, who are paying the price now, but on the builders, the providers who produce it in the first place. So let's shift the burden back to the folks who produce this stuff to say we have an expectation that at the point where you're doing your capital expenditures, you're making this resilient and robust by design. So that we then get to the pipeline providers or the operators or the financial sector that's merely using all of this stuff. We actually given them something that is reasonably resilient and robust, and we can then hold them accountable for sustaining that resilience across their operations. And perhaps kind of do things like require intrusion reporting, we require the sustainment of that through your annual kind of Sarbanes-Oxley kind of citation, but we sustain something that was built in from the get-go. And there's going to be some real investment required in that. Here's the good news. We're about to spend $1.3 trillion, right, on infrastructure investment, $1 billion of which has been specifically earmarked for cyber. But $1.2 trillion of which is probably going to be stuff that is dependent on, that is intimately engaged or dependent upon digital infrastructure. A bridge is going to have sensors on it that, because we have some optimization in terms of its mechanical engineering features, it's going to use sensors to detect kind of the status of the environment or kind of the stress and strain or the number of vehicles that are on it at this point in time. We've got to double down on making sure every one of those investments is cyber aware. And so therefore we can up our game in terms of critical infrastructure by making the investments we're about to make, ensuring that we kind of take cyber into account, not just the physical aspects of these devices into account. Having said that, I've just given you a big hand over little map answer. I just think that it's going to require some specification, some kind of move this left of event, and some kind of joint participation by the federal government and the private sector to make the investments required.
And just to add a little bit more, I think I agree with everything you've just said in terms of 85% is privately owned, but there's the water sector that we've sort of delved into in quite a lot of detail, where it's actually the opposite dynamics, where it's 80% publicly owned. And there's a lot of municipalities that are, like you mentioned, are kind of far away from federal, that are trying to build their own cyber capabilities and things like that, as well as running a water system. And that's where the second part of the question was around, is there any sort of federal strategy to try and help? Because, it is such a critical resource.
Yeah, I agree with your statistic in terms of reversing it with respect to the water sector, and without actually tipping the hand for a policy that's not yet been made, would say that we first have to stand in and understand the nature of how that is kind of set up. And I think what we're going to find is that the marginal kind of, the difference between the cost and the revenue is so slim. There's just not much left over to do anything other than just make sure the water continues to flow. We kind of discovered a while back that we need to make sure that we get the lead out of those pipes, and we're willing to make the investment in that. We need to similarly make sure that if we want to have confidence about the flow of that under assault, not just by nature, not just by kind of antiquated technology, but by people who would hold it at risk because it's attached to digital infrastructure, we need to provide for that in the rates that we assign. Good news is that's largely under the control of local kind of governments, right, as you've said. But we need to make sure that we kind of give enough emphasis to that, enough priority to that. Maybe lead with the Jeff Moss anecdote that we don't do cyber for its own sake. We do it so that we can actually do some other mission and understand what that dependency is, perhaps the first step.
Living with the cyber threats that we have, not good. Living with those threats, knowing that our national cyber director is as focused, as visionary, and as erudite as Director Chris Inglis, good.
And that you're 1, 2, and 3 years away from kind of joining the rest of us on the front lines, excellent.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Thanks a lot. Take care.